The wind that swept across the German countryside in the spring of 1945 carried with it the acrid smell of defeat. The Third Reich, once a
The
monument
Third
to
Reich, once
totalitarian
a
ambition
monument
and
to
military prowess,
totalitarian
was
ambition
crumbling
and
beneath the weight of
military
its own
prowess,
hubris.
was
Cities
crumbling
that had
beneath the
stood for
weight of its
centuries
own
lay in
hubris.
ruins, their skeletal remains a testament to the catastrophic miscalculation of one man's vision for a thousand-year empire. In these final, desperate hours, as Soviet forces closed in from the east and Allied armies pressed relentlessly from the west, the Wehrmacht faced an existential crisis that transcended mere military defeat. It was a reckoning with reality itself. Among the chaos of collapsing command structures and fractured loyalties, individual commanders found themselves confronting impossible choices. Some chose suicide, unable to face the shame of surrender. Others fled, hoping to disappear into the civilian population. But a select few, hardened by years of warfare and indoctrinated by a system that prized honor above survival, chose defiance. They would not go quietly into history's judgment. They would force their conquerors to look them in the eye and pull the trigger. This is the story of one such confrontation, a moment when the machinery of war ground to a halt, when two men representing utterly opposed worldviews stood face to face, and when the psychology of command revealed itself in its rawest, most dangerous form. General George S. Patton, Jr. was not a man given to hesitation. Throughout the European campaign, he had earned a reputation as perhaps the most aggressive, audacious, and psychologically complex commander in the Allied arsenal. His Third Army had swept through France with unprecedented speed, had relieved Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, and had crossed the Rhine with a determination that bordered on obsession. Patton understood war not merely as a chess game of logistics and strategy, but as a deeply personal test of will, a crucible in which men revealed their true nature. He respected courage, even in his enemies, and held contempt in reserve for those who lacked it. His leadership style was theatrical, brutal, and undeniably effective. He believed in momentum, in the psychological impact of relentless forward movement, and in the principle that hesitation killed more men than bullets. As American forces advanced into the heart of Germany, they encountered pockets of resistance that defied rational military logic. The war was clearly lost. Berlin was encircled. Hitler's regime was in its death throes. Yet scattered throughout the German countryside were commanders who refused to accept the inevitable. Some were true believers, Nazi fanatics who had internalized Goebbels' propaganda so completely that surrender was literally unthinkable. Others were professional soldiers, caught between honor codes, military oaths, and the dawning realization that everything they had fought for was built on lies. And then there were those who simply could not reconcile themselves to defeat. Men for whom the act of surrender represented not just military capitulation, but the complete annihilation of their identity. The German commander in question, his name has been obscured by the fog of war and the selective nature of historical documentation, held a position that was strategically insignificant but symbolically potent. His forces were isolated, cut off from any meaningful support, surrounded by overwhelming American firepower. By any rational calculation, resistance was suicide. His men were exhausted, undersupplied, and increasingly aware that the regime they served had abandoned them to their fate. Yet when Patton's forces arrived with demands for surrender, this commander delivered a response that cut through the procedural language of military convention with stark, brutal clarity. "You'll have to kill me." This was not a tactical statement. It was not a negotiating position designed to extract better terms. It was a psychological declaration, a drawing of a line that transcended the strategic realities of the moment. In those 5 words lay an entire worldview, a conception of honor that prioritized death over dishonor, annihilation over accommodation. It was the voice of a man who had been shaped by a specific military culture, one that traced its lineage back through Prussian traditions of martial excellence, through the rigid hierarchies of the Wehrmacht, and through the toxic ideological indoctrination of National Socialism. For this commander, surrender was not an option because surrender meant acknowledging that everything he had believed, everything he had sacrificed, and everyone he had killed had been in service of a lie. Patton heard those words and recognized something profound in them. He understood, perhaps better than many of his contemporaries, that this was not simply a military standoff. This was a confrontation between two fundamentally different conceptions of what it meant to be a warrior, what it meant to command, and what it meant to face defeat. The German commander was offering Patton a choice that was simultaneously simple and impossibly complex. Honor his defiance by granting him the death he demanded, or find another way forward that neither man had yet articulated. The psychology of command in wartime operates within a peculiar moral framework, one where the normal rules of human interaction are suspended in favor of a brutal calculus of necessity. Commanders are trained to make decisions that result in death, sometimes the death of enemies, sometimes the death of their own men, and occasionally, if circumstances demand it, their own death. But the decision to kill a man who is effectively already defeated, who poses no tactical threat, who is simply demanding that you validate his conception of honor through violence.
Surrender was not an option because surrender meant acknowledging that everything
it forces
he had
the victor
believed,
to become
everything
complicit
he
in
had
the vanquished's
sacrificed.
final act of defiance, to transform from conqueror into executioner, to cross a line that exists not in military doctrine, but in the shadowy territory of moral philosophy. Patton stood at this crossroads with the full weight of his personality pressing him toward a decision. Everything in his character suggested he would respect this German commander's courage. Patton had always maintained a complicated relationship with the Wehrmacht as an institution. He despised Nazism with the fervor of a man who understood totalitarianism's fundamental threat to individual liberty, yet he held a grudging admiration for German military professionalism. He had studied their tactics, analyzed their campaigns, and recognized in their officer corps a martial tradition that in many ways mirrored his own romanticized conception of warfare. Unlike some Allied commanders who viewed every German as an interchangeable component of a monstrous system, Patton understood that the Wehrmacht contained men of varying motivations, opportunists and ideologues, professionals and fanatics, those who believed and those who simply obeyed. The German commander who now faced Patton embodied this complexity. Historical records suggest he was likely a product of the old Prussian military aristocracy, a class that had maintained an uneasy relationship with Hitler's regime from its inception. These men had welcomed the Nazi Party's promise to restore German military power after the humiliation of Versailles, had collaborated in the rearmament programs of the 1930s, and had led Germany's armies through the early conquests with terrifying efficiency. But they had also watched with growing unease as ideological zealots supplanted professional soldiers in Hitler's inner circle, as strategic decisions became subordinate to political fanaticism, and as the romantic conception of military honor became contaminated by war crimes that violated every code they claimed to uphold. By April 1945, such commanders found themselves trapped in a psychological prison of their own construction. They had enabled the regime, had executed its orders, had conquered in its name. The blood of millions stained their hands, whether directly through orders given or indirectly through a system they had sustained. Some recognized this complicity and sought redemption through suicide, leaving behind letters that revealed the anguished mental contortions of men trying to reconcile their actions with their self-conception. Others retreated into denial, insisting they had merely followed orders, that they were soldiers, not politicians, that military duty absolved them of moral responsibility. And a few, like the commander now confronting Patton, chose a different path. They demanded to die on their own terms, to exit history through an act of defiance that would preserve whatever fragments of honor they believed still remained. "You'll have to kill me" was thus not merely a statement of personal preference, but an attempt to rewrite the narrative of defeat. It transformed surrender from capitulation into martyrdom, from the acceptance of judgment into the assertion of an alternative moral framework. The commander was essentially saying, "I will not validate your victory by meekly submitting to it. I will not stand trial. I will not answer for my actions in your courts. I will not participate in the theater of justice you will construct. Instead, I choose the finality of death, and I force you to be the instrument of that death, so that in killing me, you become complicit in my version of events." Patton recognized this maneuver for what it was. He had seen it before, in different forms, throughout the campaign. He had encountered SS officers who fought to the death rather than surrender,
not because they believed they could win, but because death in battle offered a kind of narrative closure that captivity could not provide. He had watched fanatics detonate grenades rather than raise their hands, preferring annihilation to the humiliation of defeat. He understood that for certain kinds of men, shaped by certain kinds of ideologies, death represents not failure but the ultimate assertion of will against an unacceptable reality. But Patton also understood something else, something that distinguished him from many of his peers. Killing this man would solve nothing. It would satisfy the German commander's desire for a dramatic exit, but it would accomplish no military objective, serve no strategic purpose, and advance no cause beyond validating a defeated enemy's final theatrical gesture. More importantly, it would transform Patton himself into an executioner, not in the legal sense of carrying out a sentence, but in the moral sense of killing a man who had already lost simply because that man demanded it. The confrontation stretched out across minutes that felt like hours. Around them, the machinery of war continued its grinding work. Soldiers waiting for orders, weapons trained on targets, the ambient noise of an army in motion. But in this small pocket of space, time seemed suspended as two commanders engaged in a wordless negotiation over the terms of defeat and the meaning of honor. The German commander's eyes held no fear, only a terrible certainty. He had made his calculation and arrived at his answer. Now he was forcing Patton to make his own calculation, to decide whether respecting an enemy's courage meant granting him the death he demanded or denying him that final act of self-determination. Patton's response would reveal not just his tactical judgment, but his fundamental understanding of what separated victory from mere violence, what distinguished a commander from a killer, and what it meant to hold power over another man's life in that liminal space where war was ending, but peace had not yet begun.
The moment crystallized into something larger than the two men who occupied it. This was no longer simply a military encounter between victor and vanquished, but rather a philosophical confrontation about the nature of authority, the limits of duty, and the question of whether a man's final request, even when that request is his own execution, deserves to be honored. Patton had built his entire career on decisiveness, on the ability to make instantaneous judgments under conditions of extreme pressure, and then commit to those judgments with absolute conviction. Hesitation, in his worldview, was the cardinal sin of command. Yet here he stood, facing a choice that defied the clean logic of battlefield necessity. The German commander's demand placed Patton in a paradoxical position. To kill this man would be to participate in what amounted to suicide by proxy. It would transform the American general into an instrument of the German officer's will rather than an independent actor imposing terms. It would grant the defeated enemy a final victory of sorts, allowing him to control the circumstances of his own death and deny the Allies the opportunity to hold him accountable through proper legal channels. The Nuremberg trials were already being planned in back rooms in government offices, a massive undertaking designed to establish legal precedents for holding military commanders responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Every German officer who died in these final chaotic weeks was one less witness, one less defendant, one less piece of evidence in the historical record. But to refuse the German commander's demand, to force him into captivity, carried its own complications. It would strip this man of his agency in his final moments, reduce him from a figure of tragic defiance to a mere prisoner, another nameless entry in the vast bureaucratic machinery of occupation and denazification. It would also require Patton to deploy force, potentially lethal force, to subdue a man who clearly had no intention of submitting peacefully. The practical logistics of taking a determined, skilled military commander alive, especially one who preferred death, could easily result in casualties among American soldiers, turning this symbolic confrontation into a pointless bloodbath. Patton's mind moved through these calculations with the speed that comes from decades of military experience. He thought about his own officers watching this exchange, waiting to see how he would handle this unprecedented situation. He thought about the precedent it would set. If he simply executed this German commander on request, would other Wehrmacht officers make similar demands, turning the final weeks of occupation into a series of assisted suicides? He thought about the politicians and bureaucrats who would scrutinize his actions, who had never commanded men in combat but felt entitled to judge those who had, who would second-guess every decision through the distorting lens of hindsight and peacetime morality. The German commander remained absolutely still, his posture erect despite the exhaustion that must have weighed on him after years of relentless warfare. He had made his statement and now waited for Patton's response with the patience of a man who had already accepted his fate. There was no pleading in his eyes, no last-minute wavering. He had committed to this course of action with the same totality he had presumably brought to every military decision throughout his career. It was this quality, this absolute certainty in the face of annihilation, that Patton recognized and, despite everything, respected. In that recognition lay a danger that Patton understood intellectually, even if he struggled with it emotionally.
The professional soldier's code, the warrior's honor, the bonds that supposedly transcended national allegiance and political ideology, these were seductive concepts that could blind a commander to moral realities. The Wehrmacht was not simply a professional army that happened to serve an evil regime. It was an integral component of that regime's machinery of conquest and genocide. The distinction between clean Wehrmacht and criminal Nazi leadership was largely a myth, a comfortable fiction that allowed German officers to claim they had merely been soldiers doing their duty. In reality, Wehrmacht units had participated in mass executions, had implemented orders that resulted in the deaths of millions of civilians, had fought wars of extermination in the East that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The commander standing before Patton carried this history with him whether he acknowledged it or not. His units had almost certainly participated in actions that went far beyond legitimate military operations. His obedience to the Nazi regime, regardless of his personal feelings about its ideology, had enabled atrocities on a scale unprecedented in human history. The honor he now sought to preserve through death was in many ways an illusion, a self-serving narrative designed to separate his identity as a professional soldier from his complicity in industrial-scale murder. Yet Patton also understood that reducing every individual to their categorical membership in a guilty institution was its own form of blindness. The German commander was not merely a representative of the Wehrmacht or a symbol of Nazi militarism. He was also a specific human being with his own history, his own choices, his own burden of guilt and rationalization. To treat him as nothing more than a uniform to be processed through the machinery of justice was to adopt the same dehumanizing logic that had characterized the regime he had served. The challenge was to hold both truths simultaneously, to recognize his individual humanity while also acknowledging his institutional guilt, to respect courage while condemning the cause in which that courage had been deployed. Patton broke the silence with words that have been reported in various forms across different accounts, the exact phrasing lost to history but the essential meaning preserved. He would not kill this man simply because the man demanded it. He would not grant him the theatrical exit he desired, would not allow him to escape accountability through death, would not participate in the construction of a martyrdom narrative that would obscure the brutal realities of what the Wehrmacht had done. The German commander would surrender, would face whatever justice awaited him, would answer for his actions before the world, rather than vanishing into the romantic mythology of the warrior's death. The German's face registered something complex, disappointment perhaps, or a grim recognition that his final gambit had failed. But Patton was not finished. He made clear that if the commander chose to resist, if he forced the issue through violence, American soldiers would respond with overwhelming force. Death was certainly available if he insisted on it, but it would be death as a consequence of resistance, not death as an honorable alternative to surrender. The distinction was subtle but crucial. Patton was refusing to validate the commander's narrative, while simultaneously acknowledging the physical reality that force would be met with force.
What followed was a silence that spoke volumes about the collapse of certainties that had structured these men's lives. The German commander stood motionless, his carefully constructed final act disrupted by Patton's refusal to play the assigned role. In that moment, the entire edifice of honor codes and warrior myths revealed itself for what it truly was, a fragile construction of meaning imposed upon the chaos of violence, a narrative framework that worked only so long as all participants agreed to the script. Patton had torn up the script, and in doing so, had forced the German to confront an unbearable reality. His death would have meaning only if someone else granted it that meaning, and Patton was declining to do so. The broader implications of this encounter extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. This confrontation represented, in microcosm, the fundamental challenge facing the Allied powers as they transitioned from war to occupation, from combat to judgment, from destruction to reconstruction. How does a victorious power deal with a defeated enemy who refuses to accept the moral legitimacy of that defeat? How do you establish accountability when the vanquished claim they were merely following orders, merely doing their duty, merely serving their nation as any soldier would? How do you prevent martyrdom from transforming criminals into heroes in the eyes of those who still believed in the cause they had served? These questions would haunt the occupation authorities for years. The Nuremberg trials attempted to answer them through legal mechanisms, establishing precedents for individual criminal responsibility that transcended claims of military duty or state sovereignty. But the trials faced enormous challenges, not least of which was the fact that many Wehrmacht officers, including some who had committed documented war crimes, managed to construct post-war identities as professional soldiers who had merely fought honorably for their homeland. The clean Wehrmacht myth persisted for decades, sustained partly by Cold War politics that made former German officers useful allies against the Soviet Union, and partly by a collective reluctance to grapple with the full implications of institutional guilt. Patton himself embodied these contradictions. He was simultaneously one of the most effective combat commanders in American history and a man whose political views and personal prejudices often aligned uncomfortably with aspects of the authoritarian systems he had fought to defeat. He admired martial valor wherever he found it, sometimes to the point of overlooking the causes in which that valor had been deployed. He believed in a kind of warrior aristocracy that transcended national boundaries, a fellowship of professional soldiers who understood each other in ways that civilians never could. This belief system made him extraordinarily effective in combat, but also created moral blind spots that troubled his superiors and complicated his legacy. In refusing to kill the German commander, Patton was making a choice that reflected both his strengths and his limitations. He was asserting that American victory meant something more than simply replacing one form of authoritarian violence with another. He was insisting that the rule of law, however imperfect, represented a higher principle than personal honor codes. He was denying this German officer the romantic exit that would have allowed him to escape historical judgment. But he was also, in some sense, protecting the man from himself, recognizing that the demand to be killed was itself a product of a poisoned ideology that glorified death over accountability, that valued theatrical gestures over genuine moral reckoning. The German commander eventually surrendered. The historical record is unclear about his ultimate fate, whether he faced trial, whether he spent years in detention, whether he eventually returned to civilian life in a rebuilt Germany, or whether he found another way to achieve the death he had sought. This ambiguity is itself significant. The vast majority of Wehrmacht officers who survived the war did not face the kind of accountability that their actions arguably warranted. Many reinvented themselves as victims of Nazi ideology rather than its enablers. Many contributed to post-war narratives that minimized Wehrmacht complicity in atrocities and emphasized the professional, apolitical nature of military service. The clean break that Nuremberg sought to establish between the Nazi past and the democratic future never fully materialized. Patton's confrontation with this unnamed German commander thus serves as a kind of historical parable about the limitations of military victory as a tool for moral transformation. You can defeat an army, occupy a nation, dismantle a regime's institutions, and prosecute its leaders, but you cannot compel genuine moral reckoning through force alone. The individuals who composed the Wehrmacht, who had internalized its values and executed its orders, did not simply cease to exist when the war ended. They carried their beliefs, their rationalizations, and their unresolved guilt into the post-war world, where those psychological burdens shaped the reconstruction of German society in ways both visible and invisible. The incident also reveals something essential about Patton's character that often gets obscured by his theatrical public persona and controversial statements. Beneath the bravado and the profanity, beneath the pearl-handled revolvers and the carefully cultivated image of aggressive certainty, there existed a more thoughtful commander than popular mythology sometimes suggests. He understood that war created moral complexities that could not be resolved through simple applications of force. He recognized that the moment of victory was also a moment of profound responsibility, when the choices made by commanders would echo through history with consequences far beyond the immediate tactical situation. In the end, the story of what happened when a German commander told Patton, "You'll have to kill me," is not really about those specific individuals at all. It is about the collision of ideologies in the final days of history's most destructive war. It is about competing conceptions of honor, duty, and accountability. It is about the limitations of military solutions to fundamentally moral and political problems. It is about the ways that individual human encounters can illuminate larger historical forces, revealing in miniature the vast conflicts that shaped an entire era. The Third Reich fell not because every individual who had served it experienced genuine moral transformation, but because the institutional structures that had sustained it were systematically dismantled by overwhelming force. Many of those individuals carried their beliefs into the post-war world, where those beliefs mutated into new forms, sometimes poisoning democratic institutions from within, sometimes fading gradually as new generations emerged with different values. The confrontation between Patton and this German commander was one tiny moment in that massive historical transition, a moment when the old certainties confronted new realities, when the mythology of the warrior's honor met the bureaucratic machinery of modern accountability, and when two men embodying fundamentally opposed worldviews stood face to face and negotiated, however briefly, over the meaning of defeat and the value of survival. History does not record whether the German commander ever understood what Patton had actually done in refusing to kill him. Perhaps he saw it as mercy, or weakness, or simply pragmatic calculation.
Perhaps he spent his remaining years haunted by the fact that he had survived when so many had not, wondering whether death might have been preferable to living with the weight of what he had been part of. Or perhaps he rationalized it all, constructed a comfortable narrative in which he had been a professional soldier who had fought honorably in an impossible situation, and Patton's refusal to execute him became simply another battle lost in a war already concluded. We cannot know. What we do know is that in that moment, Patton chose law over honor codes, accountability over romantic mythology, and the messy complexity of justice over the clean finality of a bullet. Whether that choice ultimately mattered in the vast sweep of history remains an open question, one that each generation must answer for itself.